Hey guys, I hope you're doing well. I want to take a few minutes and address a very good question that I often get from quite a few of my students, which is how do you identify what is really the difference between normal behavior and abnormal behavior? So again, great question. Again, kind of comparing what is considered normal behavior versus abnormal behavior. And one great way to do that is simply to really break it down into four particular categories. And you can look at that behavior based upon whether it demonstrates one, two, three, or really all four of these particular areas. So let's use the example of anxiety. So, anxiety, something that we all do need to a certain extent, but at what point does anxiety become abnormal? Well, one way in which we look at it is the first category, which is the category of distress. So, as I mentioned before, we need anxiety. We wouldn't exist without anxiety. Anxiety helps us in terms of maintaining motivation. Anxiety helps us in terms of staying on task. And those are normal types of behaviors. However, when does it become abnormal? Well, one way is through distress. So, what distress talks about is that your anxiety becomes so significant. It becomes so impactful in terms of your life that your basic everyday coping skills simply just do not work. And again, when we talk about the significance, we're talking about something that greatly impacts your life. And again, the key word here is over a long period of time. So let's say, for an example, you have a presentation in class. You have to get up and talk about your topic. And you're nervous going into that presentation. And right before the presentation starts, you start to cry and you run out of the room and you hide in the bathroom. Is that considered abnormal behavior? Do you have a mental health disorder? No, you got nervous in terms of your presentation, and you did what within that moment was appropriate in your mind. When does that become abnormal? Well, if you start to do that repetitively, okay, and on top of that, it starts to fall into other areas of your life. So you'd say you have another presentation coming up in a couple weeks. You do the same thing. You have another presentation in another class. You do the same thing. In addition to that, not only in school, but in other areas of life, let's say, for an example, you're starting a new job, and instead of going to your job, you avoid it. You don't show up on the first day. And in addition to that, you have events with friends that you have scheduled, and you stop going to those or you start avoiding those. Now we're starting to talk about some abnormal types of behavior. And again, that anxiety is causing you such distress that your basic everyday coping skills simply just do not work. Another area or another category we look at is what we call dysfunction. So, dysfunction kind of goes hand in hand in terms of distress. And I hinted at it a little bit. So, when we talk about dysfunction, I like to keep things nice and organized. And I look at dysfunction as we have certain areas of our life. For example, we have living. So, where we live, apartment, house, whatever it may be. We have social, our family, our friends. We have work in terms of if you have a job or not, and we have school. So those are different categories within our life. So when we talk about dysfunction, again, we'll use anxiety for an example. Your anxiety becomes so disruptive that it starts going into those different areas of our life. So if we have anxiety that's truly impacting our school, now all of a sudden it's starting to impact our ability to go to work. It's starting to impact our ability to maintain friendships. It's starting to, now we're talking about a very abnormal behavior in terms of that. Another category which we can use to really help identify abnormal versus normal behavior is the concept of deviance. Now, I'll stress this: deviance does not mean bad when we're talking about this. When we talk about deviance, we're talking about statistics. all right, particularly in terms of that behavior being demonstrated within that particular society. So we're talking about social norms. So I'll use the example of cutting, self-harm for this example. So statistically, when we look at the US, the general population, there's a very small percentage of people who cope with their anxiety by cutting or burning or biting or pulling their hair. So that is what we mean by deviant behavior, statistically not the norm. One of the things that we want to kind of keep an eye on with that, and I'll talk about this at the end, is those outside variables. Like, for example, what may be considered a statistic anomaly in one particular population may be considered normal in another, meaning they may actually do that more often. The fourth and last category we look at, pretty self-explanatory, dangerousness. So is this particular behavior could it cause harm to that particular person, like suicidal behavior? Could that particular behavior cause harm to other people in terms of homicidal behavior? Really, the cornerstone to really any good assessment. So we've got distress, we've got dysfunction, we've got deviance, and we've got dangerousness. Now, the difficulty with this is, and this is really the bigger problem, is coming up with some universally accepted definition of a mental health disorder. Now, here in the States, we have what's called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders. It is a very scientific, a very objective, and a very research-backed manual or tool to help us identify and diagnose people with mental health disorders. The problem is when we look outside of the US and we start talking about things like culture, we start talking about things like religion, sexuality, things along those lines, things start to get a little blurred in terms of what is considered abnormal behavior and what is considered normal behavior. So some things that may be accepted here in the States may not be accepted in other parts of the world, and vice versa. A good example of that, here in the United States, it's really frowned upon and is against the law, frankly, to engage in intimacy, sexual contact, things along those lines with people of a certain age or younger. In other parts of the world, it's actually encouraged. It's widely accepted in terms of that. So that, again, kind of falls on culture and how we tend to view things in terms of that. So hopefully this gives you a little bit better idea in terms of how we go about looking at abnormal and normal behavior. Obviously, if you have any more questions, feel free to drop me an email, and I'll talk to you soon. All right, thanks, guys.